Welcome to the fifth Sunday of Lent, or to breaking open the Gospel passages therefore. Welcome, first of all, to Graham, who's your first time on this. Lovely to have you on board, and we've been meaning to for a while, so we've finally pinned you down. Great to have you from the University Program, lecturer in chaplaincy studies, close to our hearts. Welcome back, Jonathan, from Auckland, probably Torbay at the moment. And welcome to Lisa from Palmerston North. And Lisa, I gather you have a little bit of background on this very famous passage.
Thanks, Michael. So, I think this is one of the most dramatic moments in John's Gospel, and that is saying something in a Gospel that is full of dramatic exchanges. And I think it's really important that we see this passage in context. In the previous chapter, a group of Jewish leaders had threatened to stone Jesus, and this passage begins with the disciples' awareness of the danger, the very real danger that Jesus is in. So the episode happens only a few days before Jesus' triumphant arrival in Jerusalem, Palm Sunday. It is the event that seals his fate. After this and the excitement that it generates, the leaders make up their mind that Jesus will die. So in many ways, this is the trigger that sets up the tragedy of Holy Week and the death of Jesus. It takes place in a house of friends. It's the first time we've encountered Lazarus and Mary and Martha in John's Gospel. We've met them before in Luke, of course. And the sisters are true to type, with Martha marching out to confront Jesus and Mary staying in the house and weeping. And the passage contains the shortest and perhaps most debated line in the Gospel, which is Jesus wept. The very brevity of the line says something about the intensity of Jesus' experience, and it should startle us. God cried, and it invites us to ponder why. Was it because he understood viscerally for the first time from a human perspective what death feels like? Was he weeping at the lack of understanding of those around him? Or because he knows that what he's going to do next, which is raise his beloved friend from the dead, is going to lead to his death? There are probably other reasons we might speculate about, but it is certainly a pivotal moment in the Gospel.
It is indeed an incredibly powerful two words in either Greek or English. So, all right, well, I want to ask Jonathan, where you find challenge when you encounter this.
You can't hold God responsible for all evil, but I can't escape the notion that Jesus is not exactly toying with Mary and Martha's emotions, but at least uses the opportunity for a teaching and or evangelistic opportunity and puts them through the ringer in the process. Now, the other is it's just a little thing I've always thought, Lazarus at least goes through something unusual. And this is, I've just always wondered if anyone gave him a garment to cover himself with when he came forth from the tomb. That's a very real thing. But these are minor challenges. In fact, I can't find any challenges of substance in this passage. Once I accepted the existence of God, I accepted that the miraculous was attached to God and hence to Jesus. And so I really struggle to find challenges in this passage. Perhaps I was just enchanted by it as a child. I don't know.
And I must underscore that I often find that if I've accepted God, which was the big leap for me, then such things as this are far, far easier to accept than that first great leap. So thank you, Jonathan. Let's go to you, Graham, and tell us where you find some challenge.
Lisa talked about the length of this narrative, and I think it is complex and multi-layered. We know that John has arranged his gospel thematically, and this is the seventh and last miracle, and sign is attached to that miracle, significance. So for me, the challenge is, how do you get inside the narrative to understand all those layers and all those complexities? And coming as I do from within the Western tradition, the first impulse is to try to analyze it, to master it with my mind and understand. But I think it's one of those texts that defies our mastery, because in some ways it keeps on asking questions of us, summed up in the question, do you believe? And what does belief mean? I remember encountering this passage through the art of Colin McCann at a McCann exhibition. In one of his 1970 paintings, Practical Religion, the Resurrection of Lazarus, showing Mount Martha, It's a larger-than-life painting spread over a vast expanse, and that really challenged me to approach this text with imagination, to contemplate the mystery with all the voices, the movement from darkness to light, from doubt to faith, from the clamorous voices of the crowd to the clear certainty of Jesus' word, and ultimately from death to resurrection.
Thanks, Graham. And again, the complexity of reading John, but a complexity of the heart, really, and not so much the head, I think, is what you're pointing to there.
Correct.
Lisa, now reading it, the challenge for you.
Well, the challenge for me in this passage is in verse 16, where Thomas says, "Let us go to Jerusalem and die with him." And, you know, the disciples at this stage are worried, but they're also full of bravado. You know, they're ready to die for him. And it turns out to be false bravado, because we know what happens next. They weren't listening. They didn't understand it. They didn't grasp the reality of what was going to happen. And it really confronts me with the question of what I'm willing to do for Jesus. You know, I say I've given my life for him. Do I mean it? You know, recently God asked me to do something for him, and I have fought and screamed and resisted all the way. So the challenge for me is, do I mean what I say? Have I understood what it means to be a follower of Jesus? And am I prepared for the sacrifices he may ask of me as I struggle to grow in faith? Am I willing to let him lead me on a new path of his choosing?
Well, if we weren't feeling challenged before, we might be now. So let's find some good news then. So let's stick with you, Lisa, because you've given an extra challenge. Bring where you find good news then.
Oh, well, for the good news, I'm honing in on Martha, because I think what she shows in this passage is it is okay to be honest with Jesus. It's okay to be angry and confrontational and grief-stricken. We don't have to pretend to be happy. He can cope with it. You know, and I've always thought that the Gospels lacked stage direction. You know, I imagine this passage, you know, is that Martha stormed down the path and she shouted at him, "If you'd been here, my brother would still be alive." And, you know, Jesus is up for that. And he's not frightened of our emotions. And by being honest, she's able to be called into the deepest expression of faith. And I think it's a beautiful moment.
It really is. It's a real heart cry. It's such a heart cry. Jonathan, give me a sense of good news.
Yes, I was thinking, I mentioned a teaching opportunity. Now, Isaiah, Daniel, and Paul probably speak a bit more overtly of this than Jesus does, but there's good news in the reminder that comes both from Martha's words, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day, and in Jesus' words, I am the resurrection and the life. You know, right there we have a solid reminder of our ultimate destiny in our own resurrection and all that that implies. And it reminds me of a preacher who apparently at a conference on apocalyptic literature stood up and said, "I am a pantheist." And a great hush descended on the room. And then he said, "I just follow Jesus and I believe it'll all pan out right in the end." The fact that all this seems to be caught up in the person of Christ is very good news for me. And I find good news in the very fact that Jesus affirms our physicality by bothering to raise Lazarus in the first place, rather than by giving Martha and Mary some kind of comfort that he is safe in God's hands. I think it was C.S. Lewis who once said, next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. There's something just so... I'm on a bit of a physicality kick, as you can gather. So I've never understood the appeal of Platonism and the Gnosticism that gives effect to it. And it seems to me that God's commitment to renewing creation, to resurrecting humankind, to the mundane, makes sense. And that God knew what God was doing in the first place by making things. Nothing is going to be jettisoned in order for Plan B, nervously, to be put into effect. God backs us, warts and all the way.
I'm hearing a little suggestion that immortality of the soul is not what Christianity is about, that there's something much more thingy than that in our gospel. Graham, bring to me some good news.
And the good news to me fell into two categories. The first is what I would call the sign, where Jesus declares this illness in verse 4 does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. The sign. And for me, that's good news because it reminds us that there is often more going on in life than what we see on the surface. In both life and death, the kingdom of God is at work. The work of Christ and the Spirit is there, often working below the surface, but always the impulse towards life. And part of the good news, I think, is clearing away so we can detect what's going on below the surface. So the sign. And the second is the assurance and the declaration, where Jesus declares to Mary and Martha, your brother will rise again, verse 23. And then the declaration, I am the resurrection and the life. And here he confronts the mystery of death with utter authority to say that death is not the final tragic word of human existence. God is in all and with all.
Well, absolutely, and really right in the depths of that poignant moment, this word of hope being spoken. Let's stay with you, Graham, because it can become very ethereal if we don't apply it. So, what's the so what? What's the application?
Well, staying with the words of Jesus, I would say there are three or four things. The question, do you believe this? So that's a so what kind of question. So you're seeing it, you're hearing me. Do you believe it? The command, take away the stone, and the call, come out of the tomb, and the release, unbind him and let him go. And I think all these words speak into our situations of unbelief and captivity to all kinds of malignant death-supporting forces, and somehow open up new life for us. So if you like, the so what is, where do you stand in relation to the key themes in this passage?
Thank you for that. Jonathan, do you relate to that? Do you find another way of seeing the so what?
I thought, well, perhaps one way of looking at it is, what do Mary and Martha take from this? And they go away with so much more than Lazarus. They take away the sense that in the Messiah, the future can touch the present, and it is down to earth, it's practical, also glorious and compassionate. When Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, he was demonstrating profoundly, as Lisa said, that compassion. And no matter how wearied he was by his ministry and a knowledge of what he faced in Jerusalem, Thomas's pessimism, a handy reminder, no matter how tempted he might have been to have become cynical about the people he was about to die for, Jesus overtly demonstrates compassion towards them. So I take a reaffirmation of a positive future for us, along with the reaffirmation that God made me right in the first place. But the compassion Jesus showed is probably what I need to take from this, and what others need to experience in me. So I think it's probably summed up in Jesus' compassion.
And I'm loving that word, and it's such a deep word, compassion. Lisa, a final word.
Well, I guess my so what goes back to what I was saying about Martha. There can be a lot of pressure on us as Christians to be happy all the time, to put on a good face, to pretend that because we're Christians, we've got our lives sorted out and we're sailing off to heaven. The journey of faith is not like that. Going to church, and sometimes we're invited to sing songs about how happy and glad we are, but maybe we're not. And there may be times in our lives when we feel God has let us down, that we don't understand, times when things come unraveled, as they did for Mary and Martha here. And here's the so what. So tell him. He can't meet you in pretense. He can only meet us in honesty. He's not frightened by the strength of our emotions. He will meet us at the darkest place, and he will bring us to new life and a newer, deeper understanding of faith. And for our churches, I would ask, do you ask people in your church to pretend? In what ways, in your liturgy, your music, in your preaching, in your conversations, can you allow everyone in your congregation to bring their untidy, authentic selves into church with them?
Thank you, Lisa, and almost come full circle to a challenge as part of the so what. Thank you so much, Graham, for being on board for the first time. Lovely to have that incisive view. Jonathan, Lisa, we know you have incisive views, but it's been great to have you with us, breaking open this beautiful passage. Thank you.